name is Naomi Goodnow. I'm actually an associate professor here at Pepperdine. But I wanted you to hear from Dean Cupp. He wanted to give you a formal Pepperdine and Malibu welcome. So.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Rick Cupp. I'm the Vice Dean of the Law School. And on behalf of Dean Taha, who's traveling on university business today, I'm very honored to be able to welcome you to the Pepperdine University Herbert and Eleanor Newbar Institute on Law, Religion, Ethics Conference on Intercountry Adoption. As you doubtless already know, at Pepperdine we're keenly interested in global justice, and every year our students go literally around the globe working to try to support the rule of law. The issue of intercountry adoption is of special interest to us because of all of the different issues that it brings together. Important questions of law, families, faith, and global justice. We're so honored to bring together this impressive group of lawyers, scholars, and leaders in the field for this conference. We hope that you're going to enjoy our wonderful campus and our beautiful surroundings, even on a stormy day. We don't get much rain here in Southern California, so I may be a little biased, but I personally think it's maybe even more beautiful on a stormy day like this, where the sun is kind of coming and going. But even more than the beauty of the surroundings that we have here, we hope that you'll enjoy this wonderful conference, and we hope that it will enrich you, challenge you, and empower you as you work toward justice and love for children and families around the globe. Thank you for coming to Pepperdine.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Cupp. And again, we just want to welcome you to Pepperdine. I am truly humbled to be on this panel with these panelists. I'm relatively new to this field, and I'm only going to speak for maybe about 10 or 15 minutes, and then let the experts do their work. And the reason why I was able to get on this panel is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, is Pepperdine did a project a couple of years ago where we actually worked with Saddleback Church and an adoption agency out of Texas, little consultation from Holt International on best practices for Rwanda, which at the time was trying to become Hague compliant. And so that's kind of where I fit in. But before I get started, I want to introduce my other panelists. Dr. Selman over here, he's going to go right after me. He is a visiting fellow in the School of Geography, Politics, Sociology at the Newcastle University. He's the editor of Intercountry Adoption, Development Trends and Perspectives, and he has written many articles and chapters on adoption policy. His main research focus in recent years has been on the demography of child adoption, with a special emphasis on intercountry adoption. He has acted as a research consultant to international organizations such as the United Nations Population Division. He holds a PhD from the University of Newcastle and a BA from Oxford. So Dr. Selman flew all the way from Newcastle to be with us. But Dr. Benham flew all the way from Ethiopia just last night. So I was talking with Dr. Benham. He looks quite awake and cheery, considering he hasn't had much sleep. Dr. Benham is the chairperson of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. He's a research fellow at the Community Law Center of the University of Western Cape, South Africa, and a lecturer and assistant professor at the Faculty of Law of UWC and Addis Ababa University. From 2003 to 2005, he was the legal officer at the African Child Policy Forum. He has published a number of articles on children's rights in Africa internationally, and has lectured and served in fellowships at numerous different universities, again, across the world. He received his bachelor's degree in law, a master's degree, and a doctorate in law from the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. So I really want to thank Dr. Selman and Dr. Benham for traveling so far to be with us today and sharing your work. So briefly, what I want to do is basically cover 4 quick points. I just want to talk about a few trends. We've already seen the statistics introduced during the first session. I want to talk a little bit about the law. And again, for the most part, you are probably a very educated group on the law, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly, but I just want to frame a couple of issues. I'll talk a little bit about the project that we did in 2010, and then just raise a few current issues that will, I'm sure, the themes have already been introduced. but I wanted to quote a few lines from some guidelines from the Hague, on the Hague Convention. Okay, so I'm sure all of you are very aware that in the United States to get a child through the intercountry adoption process, you actually have 3 groups of laws you have to satisfy: the sending country's laws, U.S. immigration law, and then whatever state the adoptive parent is domiciled in. Now, if we have a country, a sending country that is a party to the Hague Convention, we also are, the United States is a party to the Hague Convention, and so if you meet the requirements of those, you're probably going to be able to satisfy both 1 and 2 in one swoop. So we already saw Professor Bartholomew introduced us to a great chart. It's actually better than my chart, but the trend, the high being in 2004, and then we see a steady decline to, in 2011, it being around 9,000, which is dropped by more than almost 50–60% of a decline just in the United States. And some of the dates and documents, I thought you might already know this, but I thought it was kind of interesting that in the United States, the first time we started talking about adoption was actually in 1851 when Massachusetts passed the Adoption of Children Act. That only was only relevant for domestic adoption, and it wasn't really until after World War II that the United States became interested in intercountry adoption, and in fact, that's when it actually became more of a world issue. Nothing like a worldwide war to produce a ton of orphans and to bring the issue to the forefront. In 1989, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the crisis that was going on in Romania, where we saw the institutionalization of many orphans, and in that same year, the CRC, or the Rights of the Child, was also passed. We are not a member to that, the U.S. is not, but we are a member to the Hague Convention of 1993, and of course, like any treaty, the convention will only apply to states who are parties to it. We actually signed the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption in 1994, ratified in 2000, but it actually did not come into force until 2008 when all of the regulation was enacted. In 2000, there were also 2 optional protocols to the CRC, and even though we are not a signatory to the CRC, we are a signatory to both of these protocols, one of which it prohibits the sale of children, which is relevant to our discussion today. So what I want to do is just real briefly talk about these 2 key documents, the CRC and the Hague Convention, and mainly just quote some relevant language from the 2 documents. The CRC is ratified by 193 states, not us, but most of the rest of the world. And the CRC sets forth that the best interest of the child is the primary consideration. And in Article 21, it mentions a little bit, or kind of hits on intercountry adoption. And it says intercountry adoption may be considered as an alternative means of child care if the child cannot be placed in foster or an adoptive family, or cannot in any suitable manner be cared for in the child's country of origin. And so some scholars have interpreted just the plain language of this to say that foster care in country is preferred over intercountry adoption under the CRC, and there's potentially an open issue as to whether, in fact, institutional care under the CRC would be preferred over intercountry adoption, and of course there's a lot of legal debate on that. Going to the second document, the Hague Convention, 89 parties as of 2012. I have to confess that I just copied this from Wikipedia, but it looked pretty accurate. I know, I checked it out and I was like, oh, I got to check this out. But I did check it out onto the signatories on the Hague Convention. Basically, the blue and the purple are everybody who has signed, and Rwanda is not on this yet, but in fact, they did become a party in 2012. The green, which is the Russia area, has not ratified the convention, although they have signed it, and then everybody in gray are not parties. Okay, so now that I confessed how amateur I am, let's talk a little bit about what the Hague Convention provides. So in the preamble to the Hague Convention, there are basically four principles that I think that are important for us to take a look at. One is that the child should grow up in a family environment, in an environment of love and understanding, that we should enable the child to remain in the care of his or her family of origin if possible. However, recognizing that inter-country adoption may offer the advantage of a permanent family to a child for whom a suitable family cannot be found in his or her origin state, inter-country, so you could interpret this language to say that this document prefers inter-country adoption to institutional care, and there might even be an open issue that it prefers inter-country adoption to foster care in country. Now, you can see right now that there might actually be a little bit of a different way of interpreting the CRC, which preferred foster care to inter-country adoption to the Hague Convention. So we potentially have a conflict, maybe not, but potentially. And also, inter-country adoptions are made in the best interest of the child and to prevent the abduction or the sale or the traffic of children. Now, really what the Hague Convention does, even though it has these preambles, is it really just sketches forth schemes for sending and receiving countries. It's a procedural type of a treaty that says these are kind of the best practices for sending and receiving countries. The basic procedural scheme as I see it is basically fourfold. One is they have this principle called subsidiary, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but basically it encompasses what was in the preamble, that we would prefer domestic adoption over inter-country adoption. And so we are going at all costs to try that, but of course cost being very important because most of the developing countries can't afford it. You know, we in the United States are trying to do it, and our foster system and those types of things are expensive and broken, and so you can imagine the mountain of problems that creates. Secondly, that parties that are members have to establish what we call a central authority. In the United States, that's the State Department. And basically what the State Department does is it accreditates adoption agencies as required through the Hague Convention. And then there's a lot of articles in the Hague that talks about transparencies of costs and fees. And we already heard a little bit about some of the problems with that not maybe being specific enough. Now, one thing that all of these ideas are really great, but it costs a lot of money to become Hague compliant. And so this is a big problem for particularly sending countries. Okay, so this is where we entered in on the scene, Pepperdine. In 2010, we worked with Saddleback Church that was working with some government officials in Rwanda. In 2010, Rwanda was trying to become Hague compliant. And so what we did is I gathered an army of really wonderful students together, and we did a comparison of 3 countries, China, Cambodia, and Guatemala, who were signatories to the Hague, and we basically tried to look at their laws to determine what are the best practices and what are lessons learned, and what kind of principles can we come up with so that countries who are trying to become Hague compliant, what should be included in their domestic law so that they meet the Hague compliance. We picked China because it is the top sending country pretty much year after year. Cambodia in 2010 had lost the ability to participate in inter-country adoption because they weren't meeting Hague requirements at the time. They were trying to pass some domestic laws, but still, I just checked, and as January 2013, they are still not allowing adoptions. And then in Guatemala, they actually suspended adoptions on their own because of all of the trafficking issues that were going on there. Now, Rwanda has become a member of the Hague, but they have also chosen to suspend inter-country adoption until they actually have a process in place. And so you can see how this takes a lot of time to meet the procedural requirements. Basically, what we came up with were 10 best types of regulations that we thought would be good in the domestic law that would meet the requirements of the Hague Convention so that a country who wanted to become a party could, in fact, have it in there. Here we have SC and RC on my slide. That's basically sending country laws and receiving country laws. One thing we were trying to defray was the cost on the sending country and trying to put as much oversight as we could on the receiving country end. And so we basically said that, okay, you have to have a central authority to determine accreditation. That's just black letter law from the convention. we wanted specific requirements for adoptive parents from the sending country. So if you look at the China law, it's very specific at the age the adoptive parents be, what kind of financial situation they have to have, and so forth. Specific requirements as to the child being adopted, again, their type of age and stuff like that, and also domestic adoption unattainable. We suggested that they put some time limit on whether or not a child would be unattainable. We weren't thinking 5 days, but we were definitely thinking something that would move the process along. Biological parent consent, both from the sending country and receiving country, having some kind of requirements. The United States doesn't really have this, but we'd like to see that. Specific requirements for a home study of the adoptive parents, both from the sending and receiving. Transparencies of costs and payments. There's a big issue about donations to agencies in these countries and whether or not they're really donations. We thought transparency on that would be very important. Adoptive parenting training. This is actually a requirement in The Hague that adopted parents get 10 hours of training. That is required in the United States. Another thing that isn't part of The Hague, but we thought was important, that if there are any complaints as to any adoption agencies, that those should be made public, and decisions as to whether or not those agencies had violated any laws should be made public. And thorough medical history of the child, and then monitoring after placement. The Hague has actually been criticized for not having a lot of procedures in place for monitoring kids once they actually do get placed. And so this was kind of our recommendations. And what I want to do is I just want to show some of the language that we relied on in coming up with these. So not only did we compare countries, but we also relied on some language in the Guide to Good Practice. And so there is a Guide to Good Practice on that basically says, you know, this is the Hague Convention, and this is how we think that you should enact laws to become Hague compliant. One principle that we got out of this is that intercountry adoption is in fact preferred over institutional care, arguably foster care, although I think it depends what you mean by foster care. And forgive me, I'm going to have a lot of quotes up here, but I just wanted to quote straight out of the document, and it's probably small print, so I'm sorry. But basically, the Hague Convention defines the best interest of the child as not really the best interest of the child, but the real or true interest of the child. They have the subsidiary principle, but they say it's not preferable to keep children waiting in institutions when the possibility exists. And in fact, the temporary home is, so I think that's why you could argue foster care is not covered here, is not preferable to a permanent home elsewhere, and that institutionalism is not in the best interest of the child, but rather permanent family care. So at least the interpretation of the document, good practices, would definitely prefer adoption over institutionalism, maybe even foster care. Another principle that we got from this is that time is of the essence. Again, quoting from the guide, that states should monitor the length of time that children remain in temporary care. As we all know, the longer you're in temporary care, particularly an institution, the more damage is done to a child. A lot of times, a child will be left in limbo as the country is trying to decide whether they are in fact adoptable. And you know, the guide actually explains. The institution, expecting the parents to return, takes no action, and so you have this kid who's kind of left in the institution for years. And what the guide said is that we, the country, to the Hague Convention, should be finding a permanent home as quickly as possible, and in fact use the words child-friendly deadlines, and even suggests that they put time frames into their law, and then if those time frames are not met by an official or a judge, that there should be penalties. And so again, this is members of the Hague and what the best practices are. Along the same lines, again, time is of the essence. Again, no delays to really start implementing intercountry adoption if that would be the place where they get a permanent family placement, because as the guide says, it's in the best interest of the child. And again, they talk about child-friendly timeframes. In all of the laws we looked at, China, Guatemala, and Cambodia, and the US, there are no timeframes that we could see where it's like, okay, if in 6 months the parents don't come back, we're going to consider the child adoptable. But But the problem is if they don't have time frames, then children could wind up in these institutions for years. Now, one thing that's important is in emergency situations, what happened in Haiti or at the end of a war. And so the guide says that in these particular instances, we have to make great efforts to protect children from child trafficking and even suggest something like DNA verification. So if a person comes and says, I want to give this child up for adoption, to make sure it is in fact the parents that's doing it. And in fact, they even suggest that there's temporary suspension of intercountry adoption until after the disaster is kind of settled down a little bit. And then we heard this theme already in the first plenary session, but basically transparency is paramount and is in fact the best protection against child trafficking. And they actually lay out strategies. They've got 5 or 6 strategies about how you might go about in protecting, being transparent in costs and getting penalties and all of those stuff. And in fact, there's a second guide. This just came out in 2012. It was a draft on the Hague Convention for a long time, but it just came out, and the whole purpose of guide number 2 is that transparency is in fact paramount, and actually calls for a specific breakdown of costs rather than just a simple estimate of total costs. And so even though this isn't part of the actual convention, these are guides to it, and they even give, I don't know if you guys have seen this, it's really small, but they give a checklist of what we should be seeing from these adoption agencies, a couple of pages long. I just want to show you they even have payroll costs here. So very transparent on the money. And so my thought is that these laws are actually, they actually encompass a lot of the themes that we're talking about. Of course, the question becomes, how do you implement them? And then there's a whole other side to intercountry adoption in the United States, and that is that there are only 80 signatories. And we do adopt from non-Hague countries, and when we do that, the Hague Convention does not apply. And so we go back to that framework where we have to look at the rescinding countries' laws, look at our immigration law, and look at the state law. And statistics from 2009, there were about 1,300 intercountry adoptions, and of those 1,300, 4,000 came from non-Hague countries. And so the argument just isn't over the Hague, it's much broader than that. Now, granted, a lot of those were from Russia, which has signed, and we actually had an agreement with Russia, but we have a lot of loopholes on there. And in fact, for non-Hague country adoptions, U.S. immigration law applies, and the only time that the U.S. actually gets involved in the oversight is when the visa application at the end of the process comes in, and it's a really low standard. Basically, on the visa application, you say, this child is an orphan, and pretty much that's it. And the court says, okay, we trust that what you said is true, and that's it. And so there's a huge loophole in the U.S. law for non-Hague countries, as you can see. And we've seen this, and these are the themes you guys are going to hear today. We can talk about reforms on the U.S. law. We can talk about reforms on the international law. I'm not going to go through all of these because we've already heard about them. But I think what I'm humbled and proud to be a part of this group, because what we're here to talk about today is how do you actually protect the most vulnerable? And that's protect them from being institutionalized, that's to protect them from becoming street children, and that's to protect them from becoming trafficked or laundered. And so I really am honored to be a part of what you guys are talking about today. I'm honored to be on this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Selman, and he can give us some statistics on all of this stuff. So I'll bring up your slides for you.
Hi. Well, first of all, thanks to Pepperdine and Bert and Jay for inviting me to this amazing event. And special thanks to Dana for organizing it so well. I think that she deserves a round of applause on her own. Now, what you're going to face for the next 20 minutes, I'm afraid, is a constant rush through far too many slides about statistics. But what I want to do is to pick up the points that David and Elizabeth made about the United States and put this in a global context. So these are global statistics. If anybody wants the detail, email me there, and I will send you the 4 slides. But outside, you'll find 2 handouts have been prepared. One gives more detailed statistics, and I can show on a PowerPoint slide. and one is about China in particular. So let's get going. The period that I'm going to be concentrating on is really the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and this is the extraordinary rise and fall of intercountry adoption with the cliff edge that Elizabeth was talking about. And these are just some data, but it's more clear for me if I show you a few slides with figures and graphs. So let's move on. So this is the pattern over the last 10 years, and you see the rise and fall. At the top line is the world, then the top 5, and then there's the States and Europe. And just one point I want to make from this, and that is that until recently, it was true to say that half of the world's adoptions were to the United States. This is no longer true. There are now more adoptions internationally to Europe than to the USA. And these are the figures that I haven't got time to dwell on too long that show that. And so gradually a move from over 50% until 2008. Last 3 years have seen a very, very sharp climb, about 60% since 2004 in the USA. In other countries, very different in Europe. Let's have a look at some of the other countries now. So these are the 4 receiving states that took most children after the US: Spain, France, Italy, and Canada. Just have a look at the blue graph. While everybody else is going down, Italy has actually gone up. And I think this is often not fully understood, and we don't know the full story. But it's a reminder that you can't base the description of the world trends on the USA. Tempting as it is. This is a quick example of one of the factors behind what we're talking about. Not only are the numbers going down, but the nature is changing of the children who are involved. And these are some figures, unusually put from the point of view of the receiving states. And you see here that Italy, by 2009, and it's even higher now, majority of the children taken were over 5. In contrast, in Australia, it's only 9%. So, but all of them are moving upwards. And so this is the world we're facing now. Very, very different, as Elizabeth said, than the world in which it was all about babies. Let's move now quickly on to look at the states of origin. China, for a long time, was absolutely dominant in terms of sending children in this last 10 years. This shows the pattern that we've seen over the last 8 years. And the decline, obviously, is largely dominated by the declines in China, declines in Russia, and then the virtual collapse of Guatemala in the last few years. But meanwhile, Ethiopia has been going up, and they're beginning to go down. And I'll look at Africa in a bit more detail later on. But it's worth remembering the changes in the complexion of where the children are going to and where they're coming from. This just as a reminder, before we move on, about the more longer history. If you go back to the 1980s, Korea was the top country, followed by India, and then there were quite a lot of South American countries, which now really no longer feature much at all. So countries like El Salvador, Sri Lanka, from Asia, relatively few children being sent. And of course, no China, no Russia. And then we had the instance of Romania, I'll talk about in a minute. And then we had this growth where everything should be dominated by China and Russia. And more recently, suddenly, Ethiopia's moved up to being the second most country. So I'll come to all of these in a bit more detail, but it's reminded all the time the nature of the direction of intercountry adoption is changing. The other thing that's changing is that there more and more children are not only older, but have special needs. And there are some very, very interesting extreme cases of this. Chile used to send lots of babies. Now it's 100% special needs, most of them older. Brazil, the same pattern. In Eastern Europe, often ignored, Latvia, Albania, Lithuania, these are countries which have got quite substantial, flourishing domestic adoption, but they find it very hard to place 2 types of children. One are the special needs, and the other one, which is less talked about, are the Roma children. So there are all sorts of hidden things about why children are sent by countries. And then at the bottom there, with China, you see the growth in China, which I'll come on to later on. So this has meant a change in the adoption by continent. Asia is still the main source, but then Asia is a very large continent, so that's not surprising. But otherwise, we had a quite interesting pattern, and you see at the bottom, as recently as 2003, Africa accounted for only 5% of all the adoptions internationally. Now it's up to a quarter. And this is even more dramatic if you looked at the United States. For the United States, for a long, long time, black was certainly not beautiful, and they were very, very reluctant to adopt. And then whether it's Angelina or the market, I don't know. But suddenly, of course, now Africa is much favored. So very great changes there. But that's the continental pattern. And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes of an hour, is look at each of those continents and see some of the key things there. So let's think about Asia. Asia, at one stage, was really very, very dominant until the mid-1980s, and mainly dominated because of Korea. It's still the main source, but things are changing, and it changes according to which country you're looking at that's receiving. But it's also been the source of many, many concerns, and these have been touched on: India, Vietnam, Nepal, Cambodia. All of these very, very serious issues. So despite the length of the tradition, Asia has become a problem in many ways. Let's have a look at China now. And there's a more detailed handout outside if you want it. China, these figures are based on the children received by countries like the USA. China has got its own figures, which are broadly the same, but I'm not going to use those because they're only available for 5 years. So we see here very much dominated by US adoptions. Spain, huge rise at one stage, and then a huge fall. More recently, everybody's going down, and I'll say a little bit at the end about what's happening next. So the numbers in China have gone down. Why? Much argument. One thing that is often neglected is that there is now a very big demand for babies, healthy babies, from Chinese couples themselves, who were previously limited on taking these because of the one-child policy. This has been eased. So now there's much more domestic adoption. And that's why China has switched increasingly to placing internationally older children, special needs children, and indeed more boys. So it used to be 95% girls from China. Now it's only about 3/4. And that's changing all the time. This is an example of the actual change in the Chinese special needs. Those of you working in adoption will know this is a very dominant part of negotiating with China for children at the moment. So overall, in this very, very short period, this is a period covered by the Hague Convention recently, there's a change from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 2 children with special needs. But look also at the variation across the countries. And again, very striking, Sweden above all, and now taking 70% of the children going from China to Sweden are special needs. So it's a very, very different world. As we go the numbers down, we're also changing in terms of the nature of the children. And that means a lot of changes in the way we think about international adoption and about the way we prepare parents for it. Right, I'm now going to move on to some other Asian sending countries. Here again, we see some quite extraordinary changes. So Korea, for long, the dominant source of children for the United States especially, has been going down steadily. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The Philippines has been fairly sort of static and slightly rising, in fact. India has been going down, but again, is not dramatically. And Vietnam represents the ups and downs that come when the country's got all sorts of problems that every now and then. And as you know, at the moment, Vietnam has finally ratified the Hague Convention, but the US is close to it. So Korea, yes, I mean, Korea still remains the dominant country historically. Starting with the Korean War, now something, various estimates, certainly over 170,000 children adopted worldwide from Korea. And this is a small country, and it's now a rich country. So there's a lot of interest in Korea and what's going to happen to it. And now there's a new act finally passed, which stresses very much the importance of domestic adoption in Korea. And I think we can safely say that we will see no rise in Korean adoptions, and that logically, in the next 10 years, Korean adoption will end. And one might say, well, when the country is as rich as Korea, that's what should happen. But of course, there's still major problems about for the births outside wedlock there. I want to now just quickly have a look at the pattern of Korea. These are the Korean figures themselves. And you see this sort of steady decline since 1998 in numbers. And really, this applies to practically all of the countries that are involved in taking children from Korea. But it's interesting to contrast Korea with India. So I'll pause a little bit on this one. India is, as you know, a much larger country than Korea, and yet the numbers of children sent by those two countries in recent years are very similar. And so one could say of Korea, if there's too many children from Korea, then surely there must be too few children from India. But it's quite interesting also to look at the in-country pattern, and great leaps forward in India recently in terms of the number of domestic adoptions, although minute in comparison with the needs of the children in that country. If you have a look at the figures at the bottom, you can see that. Korea, even as it begins to move towards the end of intercountry adoption, is taking about, 5 times more per head of population or births than it's the case in India. So very big contrast there, and it raises totally different questions about the nature of intercountry adoption, why it's being done, what it should be doing, what is the right level. We've looked now at Vietnam. Vietnam, as I say, has been a country that has gone up and down ever since the baby lifts of the Vietnam War that we'll be seeing in the film later on. And you can see here some of the rise and falls and the declines recently. So at one stage it looked as though Vietnam might begin to compensate for the declines in China and Russia, and then recently it's fallen very sharply. And you can see in the USA, 0 in 2011, and the same is going to apply in 2012. We talked a bit about Romania already. There was a period when, just before the fall of Ceausescu, intercountry adoptions were declining sharply, and many people were predicting an end to intercountry adoption. Then came Romania, this spurt, and suddenly, all over the world, people saw images of the Romanian orphanages, and people moved, often without any organization, into Romania to take children. And when we talk about why Romania now has stopped, is it the EU? I think not, and I'll say why in a minute. But Romania feels very strongly about what's happened to it. And if you talk to people in Romania, they are very worried about their tradition of adoption. And also, again, there's the hidden issue of which children were being adopted, and many of those, of course, from the Roma minority. So there's all sorts of questions about Romania that make it less than simple. Anyway, Romania spurted up and went down. And after that is when China and Russia gradually maintained the long upward point that Elizabeth was talking about in relation to leading to the cliff edge from 2004. But I want to just look briefly at Eastern Europe. And this is quite interesting because it's often assumed to say that it was the EU that stopped Romania and Bulgaria from sending children for adoption. But have a look down there and you'll see that Russia and Ukraine have been the main sources, biggest countries. But then alongside Bulgaria and Romania going down, these were the most recent recruits to the EU, there are other EU countries, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, Latvia, have consistently sent quite substantial numbers. So there's no way that the EU has banned countries from sending. But these countries are sending primarily special needs children, and it's a way of balancing the situation that they've got in relation to their own childcare program. And the quality of many of the adoptions from Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary are very, very high, very well organized. But mainly they're dealing with other European countries. Russia. Well, we've already heard enough about Russia to probably satisfy us, but it is, of course, a quite remarkable situation where children become a sort of pawn in the battle over political issues. But we must remember that there were also a series of very unfortunate incidents in relation to Russian children, especially in the United States. And, you know, if there's a dozen or so people have been convicted of murdering their adopted children, it takes quite a lot for that to take place. And so the extent of other abuse. And often this is because the children from Russia have got very considerable needs, and the parents who have taken them were very ill prepared. Hence the putting on of the child onto the plane back to Russia. Reminder that as we move into this new world in which older children and special needs children are being adopted, we are going to need to take much greater care. Otherwise, we are going to do disasters for these children who are taken at an older age, learn a new language, they've got many problems, and then to be rejected in the country that hosts them is one of the worst things that can happen. So adoption is not the beginning. It's got to go right through. Some quick figures on Russia, and you see there really quite a remarkable decline in terms of the numbers, especially if you look at the USA. You know, 2004, nearly 6,000, going down to less than 1,000 in 2011, and with this ban, this will go on. Let's move on quickly, so my time's running out. Latin America used to be the main source of children for intercountry adoption. Top 10, 6 of them were Latin American, now far fewer. So these numbers have gone down very dramatically. Brazil still sends a number of children, mainly older ones. Let's just have a quick look at 2 of the Latin American countries. This is the pattern that Colombia going steadily, and I'll be talking in the seminar later on today about what's happened to Colombia now. Haiti with this great spike that occurred and then down. And so two countries that were very important have now more or less ended. Whether they will revive is another matter, but one hopes that they will only revive if there's major changes in the structures. So Guatemala, often not recognized how far Guatemala has been totally dominated by the United States. Most European countries had identified the problems in Guatemala long before the decline began in the United States. And it was their decision not to take from Guatemala, not Guatemala's decision not to send. And I think that's often neglected. Child rescue or child theft, well, you've all read about the Haitian earthquake. Great difference between countries in terms of this. Only 3 or 4 countries took children from Haiti anyway. And there was this sort of great expediting of children who were ready, waiting to be adopted, and huge numbers adopted just in 2 months. And many people, including the Special Commissioner of the Hague, very worried about this and what the implications are. So, I mean, Haiti, I think, still opens up all sorts of arguments about whether it was a great rescue or whether it was an example of child stealing, more or less. And that's something we can debate more. Just a quick look at the Haitian figures. And there you see this huge rise in 2010, doubling of numbers, most of those occurring in the first 2 months of the year, and then compensated by complete collapse while things were trying to sort out. And so Haiti, I think, on looking back, all sorts of problems. Finally, intercountry adoption from Africa, and I am going to end now. So intercountry adoption from Africa has been the dominant thing in recent years. And more, it's now the court of all adoptions. But remember that this, in most cases, is about Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has been absolutely dominant. Madonna, I could have put it, please, Angelina. Let's have a look at Africa. You see there, I mean, more than 2/3 of all adoptions from Africa from one country, Ethiopia. And we could go, I could spend a whole lecture on talking about why that is. But very much dominant. But some quite interesting changes recently. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the sources. This shows the dominance of Ethiopia in 2 years shown up there. If you go to 2011, you get a very, very different picture. There are some countries like Madagascar and Liberia, which used to say many children don't. And now there are these that have suddenly begun to emerge. Congo, Nigeria, Uganda, not catching up with Ethiopia, but are the dominant African countries. And I'll end by just have a quick look at those. This is Ethiopia, peaked in 2009, now going down. Again, very important towards the end for the United States. In the early years, the United States was taking far fewer. If you take standardized rates, but I was talking about with India there at the bottom, 0.03, very, very low rate. Haiti at its peak, nearly 10. So there's a huge range in terms of the impact when you look at adoptions in relation to the size of the country. And in that sense, Ethiopia and Africa is the highest in Africa, but there's a long, long way you could go. So in principle, when Elizabeth talks about hundreds of thousands, if you were to, at the level of Ethiopia in other African countries, then, 1 minute to go, then indeed you would have large numbers. And that, I think, is part of the reason why there's this tremendous reaction about Africa in the Congress last June. So ending quickly, Congo is a huge country. So the potential there is vast. And very, very consistent rise in recent years. Very much dominated by 2 countries, USA and Italy. I could go on to more detail, and I can send in details if they want it. Have a look at Uganda. We talked about Uganda. Uganda is, in a sense, almost a one-country state like Guatemala. All of them been going to the United States. So there's some big issues there, and we've heard a lot about that. And I think there's a seminar coming up on the panels on Uganda, so we can learn a lot more there. And finally, and these are my last words, I promise, the United States, don't forget that the United States send a lot. The figures in yellow there are the figures recorded by the countries that receive them. The red figures are those that are stated by the State Department as the actual number sent. So there's an interesting gap there. And I could sidetrack into all the stories about children being sent to gay couples in the Netherlands. We still don't know the full story there, but there's some very interesting questions about these. What happened in 2012? Well, I haven't got time to really go through that. We've only got a few bits of data coming in. But the signs are, as was indicated by David and I think Elizabeth, the numbers are going down. China may be leveling off, but other countries are beginning to decline very sharply. And I'll touch a bit more on those if anyone's interested in the panel, which is, I think, about 4:30 tonight. Sorry about the rush, you probably didn't answer a word of it, but email me if you need it.
I usually say I'm vertically challenged, so I'll have to lift this a little bit up. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've already been introduced. My name is Binia. I am Ethiopian. Ethiopia has been mentioned quite a few times this morning, and I'll be able to, hopefully I'll be able to reflect on some points, be it in the form of a question and answer or even during tea time. I am the chairperson of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child of the African Union, and what we do within that committee is that we monitor the implementation of a certain document called the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Africa is the only continent at the regional level that has its own child rights document. So it's more or less the equivalent of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we currently have around 50 countries that are states parties to that instrument. And the committee monitors the implementation of the charter in those respective countries. But I just want to say at the outset that whatever I will be saying now does not necessarily reflect the views of any organization that I'm associated with. It's a constant conversation that we have within the African Committee, and I've just joined the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I'm sure this conversation will continue. So I don't want you to take it to mean that whatever I say here is necessarily a representation of the position of those institutions that I'm associated with. What I intend to do, which I believe is fairly straightforward, you can see from the title that I will be talking about Africa, of course, and the Hague Convention in Africa, definitely. But I will spend a significant amount of my time talking about some of the visible trends that one can deduce from the ground that is taking place in Africa. This may relate to legislation, policy, practice, and some of the challenges, but also opportunities that happen on the ground. When people ask me, I'm happy to see this morning that Professor Bartlett and Professor David disagreed without being disagreeable. It doesn't always happen like that, and I think you've set the standard and the tone for all of us who will be talking from this point onwards. And I can see that Dr. Seaman and Dr. Seaman didn't take a position. He was more of neutral. I will see how far I can go along those lines. But my purpose, I believe, is I'm not going to be pessimist. I'm not going to be optimist. I will more of try to be a realist because I claim to know more than 47 African countries, and I've had the opportunity to engage with a number of them on the ground. Now, what I intend to do, I will just, this being as a backdrop, I will say a few words about some preliminary points that portray what's happening on the ground, but also at the theoretical level, what's happening in terms of legislation and policies. And it's from those realities that I'll try to deduce some of the trends that I said I'll be able to spend some time on in about 5 minutes' time. And I'll say a few words about the way forward as I see it. Intercountry adoption doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are a number of, and I'm not original in saying this, there are a number of contexts that one needs to take into account. And this is more so in the context of Africa. And this context relates to the social, cultural, legal, economic, religious. For instance, in terms of religion, a good portion of Africa is Muslim. Now, when we saw the slides, we saw that Ethiopia is the #1 sending country. And the question one should ask could be, Ethiopia is not the largest country in terms of population in Africa. Nigeria is #1. But then when you ask yourself, why isn't Nigeria #1 in terms of being a sending country? Is it because they have less children that are deprived of their family environments? That's not true. It's partly because of the fact that 50% of Nigeria is Muslim. And I don't want to portray Islam as a sort of a monolithic entity. But in the majority of instances, let alone intercountry adoption, even adoption is not allowed under Islamic law. If you try to look at the social, cultural, legal, even historical, there are some countries in Africa that look at intercountry adoption in a very bad light. And that is related to the fact that historically, some of these countries were deprived of adopting their own children through legislation. I think Lesotho could be one classical example, where the Basotho were not allowed to adopt their own children, but the colonizers were allowed to adopt the Basotho children. So when you go and try to speak to the minister in Lesotho or Niger or Chad, if you find out that that person has a very negative perspective about intercountry adoption, or adoption for that matter, it's important to understand that the angle that they're coming from is informed by their experience. And it also ties well with the legislative framework that we currently have all over the continent. Quite a number of legislation on the African continent still predates the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It still predates the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And it still predates the Hague Convention on intercountry adoption. So to make a long story short, it's outdated. It either doesn't regulate intercountry adoption, even when it regulates it, it doesn't regulate it in a sufficient manner. So when we talk about Africa being the new frontier, one of the contextual issues that we need to look at is whether or not Africa is prepared to regulate intercountry adoption in a child-friendly manner, in compliance with the international framework, and in the best interest of the child. And in the majority of instances, the answer is no. You can't try to regulate a 21st century issue with a 20th century legislation. You can talk about, in Malawi, the 1949 Act of Adoption. What does it say? It has like 5 or 6 paragraphs. So you're pretty much leaving things to be decided by a social worker or someone within the ministry or someone in the judiciary. And that deprives the opportunity of certainty. Yes, flexibility is important, but flexibility that doesn't give you any sort of certainty is anything but good. So these are some of the contextual issues that I believe need to be taken into account when we talk about Africa being the new frontier. Now, I have selected few preliminary points. I can start with adoptability. And unfortunately, different countries have different standards in terms of who's adoptable for adoption. In a number of African countries, there is confusion between children that are deprived of their family environments permanently and children that are deprived of their family environments temporarily. And if you look at the international framework, be it the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, the CRC, or the African Children's Charter, none of it prescribes intercountry adoption as a measure for children that are deprived of their family environment temporarily. But when you go back to the domestic law to determine which children are deprived of their family environment permanently or temporarily, you don't necessarily get much guidance. In fact, data collection is so weak. Let me give you as a good example. In Sudan, there are children that are imprisoned with their mothers, but remain behind bars after the mother is executed. It should shock you. This is a clear indication of the kind of data collection that is happening in those environments. It's not necessarily directly relevant to this, but it shows you the kind of weak data collection or information management that actually exists. It's in many instances where children enter institutions, you don't have the necessary data management in place. I know for a fact that there are children who come into orphanages with a different name, with their real name, and come out with a completely different name. Let alone other sophisticated issues about their age, about their lineage, about the tribe they come from, the parents, and how they enter the child welfare system and so forth, which appears to be very problematic in many countries. Now, if you talk about eligibility to adopt, the Hague Convention is fairly flexible. It leaves a lot of discretion to state parties. Countries of origin have a number of options. They provide for marital requirements, for instance, age requirements, and I outlined some of the countries here. And as you can see, they're diverse. As much as I don't want to portray Islam as a monolithic entity, Africa is not a monolithic entity as well. But you can draw some common traits running through the majority of African countries that engage in relation to intercountry adoption. Free and informed consent. There is a reason why the drafters of the convention, both the Hague Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, provide the word free and informed. What is happening in some African countries is that an African mother, in the majority of instances, finds it alien that she can actually put her thumb mark on a small piece of paper, and with it, there goes her rights and responsibilities as far as that child is concerned. It just doesn't work like that. And the system is so huge, so you can't fight the system. So you more or less have to fit into the system. How do you try to convince a mother that this is actually adoption? It's intercountry adoption. You're not sending the child to school, and the child is not going to come and support you when that child turns 18. You're actually letting go of this child permanently. You need to go into the nitty-gritty details. You need to have every I dotted and every T crossed kind of exercise. so that the mother doesn't come to the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Ethiopia and cry at the gate every single day. It's one thing to lose your child. It's completely different and of a higher level to lose your child for a reason that you didn't understand properly. The Hague Convention provides for the so-called the no initial rule or the no initial contact rule. What does this rule say? It's provided for under Article 29. I'm not going to go into the details in the interest of time, but it practically says that it wants to reduce the opportunity for prospective adoptive parents and family of origin having a contact in order to reduce any sort of inducement. And of course, if this rule was applied in African countries, it would help to reduce with the real and sometimes the perceived conflict of interest or inducement that is taking place on the ground. Now, quite a few things have already been said about illicit or irregular activities related to intercountry adoption in the previous session. One of the characteristics that disturbs me the most, that I sleep over, is not only the fact that one child is trafficked here or another child is trafficked there and so forth. It's about the fact that the system is not prepared to address mass trafficking related issues. And I want to be very honest with you. When people ask me whether I support intercountry adoption or I oppose intercountry adoption, I often say, this is my standard response, one-line response. I say, it depends on which child, which parents, at what cost. I don't want to have a sort of a vending machine response, you know, where you can put money up there and then get a Coke down there. It doesn't work like that. So the irregular activities in some of the African countries that, as I said, disturbs is the fact that we're talking about huge numbers. And I mentioned some examples here. Rwanda, 41 children. Sierra Leone, there was a situation called, in relation to an organization called Hague, where more than 30-something children were taken on board. And the mothers actually came into the organization and complained, all of them, with the same voice, with the same tone, that they didn't understand about the document that they were signing. And the subsequent implications of that document has deprived of their opportunity to raise their own children. And it's interesting to see Cameroon on the list, because now in Cameroon, the issue of scams is coming into the picture. You'll get emails saying, if you want to adopt a child from Cameroon, blah, blah, blah. So that's taking place not only in Cameroon, but in some of the countries in Africa. Now, addressing improper financial gains and corruption is very important. And when we talk about improper financial gains, it's important to appreciate also the exchange rate in that specific country. If you give a guard who's a guard of the orphanage, if you give him $10 as tip because he helped you load your luggage on the car, it might appear as being something completely different. Because the exchange rate in that specific country of $10, for Ethiopia, for instance, $10 is 190 birr. That's his monthly salary, if he's lucky. I'm just mentioning this as an example. And things need to be understood within the local context that the children actually exist. Falsification of documents, guardianship orders, I think Uganda is represented here and probably will be talking about it. That continues to be a problem. Private, independent adoptions. Countries still insisting on residency requirements. And I don't believe that residency requirements are the way to go. Partly because they keep children in orphanages. But you have to ask yourself, when you see what people do, it makes you judgmental. It's when you try to go into details and try to understand why they do it that it makes you understand. African countries are not mad. They have a real reason why they provide for a residency requirement. It's because of the fact that the child protection system is not in place. It doesn't help to protect the children in a proper manner. So they believe that by applying a residency requirement, which lasts 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, then they will be able to understand the prospective adoptive parents in a good way. That's their way of protecting their own children. Staff transfers from government office to private adoption agencies is one of the last points that's on the slide. And it has happened in a number of countries where I can give you a real-life example where the head of the children's department at the Ministry of Women's Affairs actually moved to be a director in one of the Italian adoption agencies. Now, can you expect the people at the Ministry of Women's Affairs to have some proper supervisory role over this adoption agency? Can you? This guy, who's now the head of this adoption agency, used to be their boss for 21 years. Now, let me go to the main points, which are some of the trends that I want to draw from some of the slides that I highlighted. There seems to be a trend in terms of a more realistic recognition of the challenge that exists on the ground. And what does this mean? This means that, yes, intercountry adoption is supposed to be one of the options, but in the meantime, we need to provide for other concrete and wide alternative care measures on the ground. This also means that we need to work very hard on preserving families, what is called avoidance of alternative care. I mentioned unrealistic arguments, the one that says children are our resources, and so forth, so forth. In some instances, children are the future. That's what I'm tired of hearing that. In fact, children are tired of being the future. They want to be the present. They have to form part and parcel of the present in order to be part of the future. I'm not saying anything original. So some of these arguments are sort of fading into the background, which I believe helps in terms of taking children out of orphanages. It helps keeping children with their families. HIV/AIDS is another issue. The rollout of antiretroviral drugs is increasing on the African continent. And with that, logically, we would assume that children that are deprived of their family environments permanently would reduce, because it means that their parents will live longer. The inadequacy of laws and policies is also being increasingly recognized. And as I said earlier, African countries are increasingly saying, we're not immune from this. We don't have the necessary framework. And we need to put in place the necessary framework in order to protect our children's interests. The conceptual clarity is also increasing, and I'll come to this at a later stage. Comparability to play more role in ratification. What do I mean by comparability? Currently, the ratification of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption stands at 14. In the past, countries such as South Africa have been state parties, or Mauritius, 1999. But if you go to Ethiopia and tell them that South Africa is a state party, they don't see the comparability there. South Africa, yes, is an African country, but if you look at the GDP of Ethiopia and South Africa, they will say to you, we don't have the resources that South Africa has. So it's more convincing to tell the government of Ethiopia that Kenya is a state party to the Hague Convention, and with the resources, which is comparable to that of Ethiopia, they're implementing the convention. And I believe the trend is moving in that direction, and it will help to increase the ratification level. Also, it's important to take into account that competing interests over ratification of international documents on children's rights is reducing. What do I mean by this? For instance, the two optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and the optional protocol on child prostitution, child pornography, and child trafficking, has already been ratified by a number of African countries, which will give them the opportunity to look into other child rights-related documents in order to ratify. I have had this experience where I go to a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of a given African country, and they say to me, look, here is the list. So from this list, how do you expect us to prioritize the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption? And I don't have an answer to that question. So they have a list on maritime, on border issues, on trade, you name it. So the fact that the two optional protocols are more or less satisfied by many African countries is helping to move the ratification agenda in relation to the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption. Now, 14 countries I've already mentioned, and 2 have just recently come on board in 2012. But there are other countries that are of interest. For instance, Benin, Namibia. Namibia, the process has been ongoing. It's frustrating, partly because of the fact that the children's bill has been going on for the last 10 plus years. But at least they're close to ratifying that instrument. Benin, DRC, Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, Malawi, Zambia, Ghana. Ghana, there has been a memorandum that has been sent from the cabinet to the relevant ministry, and we believe that that process will come to fruition soon. But apart from ratification, one of the trends that we're seeing on the ground is the fact that even without ratification, countries are trying to domesticate some of the elements of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption into the domestic law, which I think helps. In fact, if the whole ratification process is going to be long-winded and dragged out like the way it happened in Namibia, it might be better to include the main elements of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption into the domestic legislation and try to implement that. Because ratification is not a silver bullet. And the Hague Convention Office, the Permanent Bureau, also admits to this. Now, Practice of complementing laws with guidelines is another trend, and I mentioned some examples. The role of the judiciary is also one point that needs to be highlighted, but it's also important to point out that there is sometimes friction between the legislature and the judiciary. If we give the opportunity to the judiciary to start lawmaking, and as it has happened in Malawi, it's important to manage that friction that might pan out between the judiciary and the legislator. Now, there is also a tendency, I can say a trend, in terms of looking up to regional organizations, including my own, which is the African Committee of Experts. And Africa is increasingly looking inwards as opposed to outwards. Strengthening the alternative care option is the other trend that you see on the ground, avoidance of alternative care, proposals on improving domestic adoption. But unfortunately, in some African countries, there is already evidence that a huge number of inter-country adoption might be undercutting efforts in relation to other alternative care measures, including domestic adoptions. There are only 2 countries that I know of that have a concrete domestic adoption policy on the ground. One of them is South Africa. And many of the African countries are just doing domestic adoption just randomly when a parent becomes available. Otherwise, there is no proper domestic policy on the ground to promote domestic adoptions. And again, this doesn't work in the best interest of children because it means keeping children in orphanages. A move away from the reactionary approach. The reactionary approach meaning that Rwanda had a problem in terms of inter-country adoption, so they needed to come on board the Hague Convention on inter-country adoption. Or Namibia had a number of incidents in terms of violations of children's rights in the context of inter-country adoption, so they started thinking about ratifying the Hague Convention or tightening the bolts as far as their domestic legislation is concerned. This reactionary approach doesn't help. As always, it's better to prevent than to cure. Now, I mentioned here one example, and I'm coming to my last slide. Increased meaningful engagement by receiving countries is absolutely, absolutely critical. And I mentioned the example of the US Department of State, and I promise you I'm not mentioning this because Ambassador Jacobs is here. And it clearly outlines how the US Department of State is trying to engage with sending countries. And this is a list of notices, and this is not even a complete list. And if you look into the nitty-gritty of these notices, you will see some of the concerns of the State Department, the embassy in that specific country, and how it's trying to alleviate that problem. Because in the number of instances, many African countries' governments do not have the capacity. And they don't look at inter-country adoption being a priority, even when they have that capacity. So this engagement from the receiving countries is absolutely, absolutely important. And this engagement will have to come not only from the US Department of State, but also other countries. Because in some instances, what has happened is that one country says one thing to the ministry, another country says something else to the ministry gets confused. I cannot tell you how many emails and letters I have received from some countries asking me whether I believe they should shut down the inter-country adoption system in that country. And I've never said yes to any of those requests, because I do believe that unless in other ways you have a plan in place, you shut down, then what happens? If you're going to shut it down for 6 months, if you're going to tighten your bolts in terms of domestic legislation within 6 months, and if you're going to open it after the 6 months, then it's fine. But if you're just going to close it open-endedly, and there is this unfortunate situation in Africa where things work on election cycles. When election comes, everything falls between the cracks. No government official wants to talk to you. And the thing will drag on for years and years. So if you are trying to shut down a system without a proper plan in place, then it's going to be very problematic. And I find it very problematic to tell to any specific country that they should shut down their system without a necessary game plan being set on the ground. And there are some concerns that I highlight here, but I'm not going to go into them in detail because of time. Now, this is my last slide. Asking the right questions. I am not personally concerned, also as the chairperson of the African Committee, I'm not concerned about the 5,000 children that are adopted from Ethiopia every year. I'm not worried about the number. In fact, if you continue with that pace, and let's assume there are 5 million orphans in Ethiopia, out of the 5 million, 2.5 million are adoptable. With that pace, it will take us 500 years. I don't know about you, my life expectancy as an Ethiopian is 57. So it will take 500 years to address all things being normal and static, that is. So nobody believes that intercountry adoption is supposed to be the major response for children that are deprived of their family environments. It has to be part and parcel of that process. And making it part and parcel of that process also requires taking measures before taking measurements. Taking measurements before taking measures, in the sense that you have to know what's happening. What is the profile of the children? So the 5,000 children from Ethiopia that concerns me is the profile of the children. How did they enter the child welfare system? Are they really children deprived of their family environments permanently? Those are the points that I lose sleep over. Wasn't there any other child, be it as a result of poverty, being deprived and so forth, who should have benefited from the system more than this child who was pumped into the system because his aunt works in the orphanage? These are the things that keep me awake. The orphan crisis versus family support crisis needs to be understood properly. The need to fast-track the harmonization process is important. Seeing the red signs for what they are is very important. Red is not the new green. Red is not the new purple. Red is not the new black. Red is red. So when you see the green signs, when there is a huge number of relinquishment coming from the same community, this is a red flag. When you see that one police officer is actually authorizing the majority of relinquishments or abandonments, this is a red sign. Minimizing the negative external pressure. When the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption was negotiated, unfortunately the agreement was made in such a way that receiving countries would contact the sending countries. But in an ideal world, it should have been the other way around, which is more of don't call us, we'll call you kind of arrangement. But that didn't prevail during the day. But at least as things stand now, that should be the practice that we're moving towards, that sending countries identifying their needs, and then receiving countries responding to that need that countries have expressed. Empowering prospective adoptive parents is absolutely, absolutely critical. In some instances, this can actually prove to be the make or break in terms of addressing the trafficking issues or the illegal adoption issues that we face in a number of countries. And the post-2015 adoption, the agenda, rather, in relation to MDGs, is, I think, should be everybody's interest. And you need to keep an eye on that, how it's going to pan out, because it will have, I believe, significant implications on the way the adoption trends will continue, on the way we cater to children that are deprived of family environments, and on the way the international community actually supports countries that actually have that specific need. My last point is this, that in everything that we do, we have to be evidence-based. Many things are sensational, and I am a lawyer by training. And I say there are three sides to a story. Your story, my story, and the true story. And in order to know the true story, you have to be evidence-based. Thank you very much.